Today, Dr. Erwin Warkentin goes into how the Allies in World War II used porn and so-called black propaganda tactics to bring about the end of the Nazi regime. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. When you consider the effect of stories we tell and the power of the human imagination, we rarely, if ever, talk about the power stories can have at times of war. We don't often talk about how stories can be an important asset in bringing about victory and then holding on to the peace. These days, when we talk about fake news, it is just one form of propaganda. On this episode, I have my longtime collaborator, friend, and former professor, Dr. Erwin Warkentin, on the show again, this time to talk about how the Allies employed different propaganda tactics against the Nazi regime of Germany in World War II. Dr. Warkentin has done extensive research on the subject and has written 3 books on the subject. While we talk about all this, you might want to visit my show notes. There are some of the original pictures from his research, including documents from the time. This episode is part 1 of 2.
Hi, I'm Erwin Warkentin. I'm a former professor of German and Communication Studies, and today we are going to be talking about porn and how that caused the collapse of the Nazi Empire in World War II.
It is so good to have you on the show yet again, Dr. Warkentin, my wonderful longtime collaborator and partner in crime. We have to set the stage here. For many people, they have no idea what is going on. None of us were alive during that point in time. So, where do you want to start?
I'm going to start not in World War II, but we'll start in World War I. But I'm going to go through that really, really quickly. So I'm not going to have a lot of details there because the whole story actually starts there. We have a fellow by the name of Lord Northcliffe, a.k.a. Alfred Charles William Harmsworth. He was a publisher. He had newspapers. He was one of the biggest newspapermen in the UK. And this is before the First World War. He is actually the person who is singularly responsible for the destruction of the so-called penny dreadful by introducing the halfpenny dreadful. In other words, he was selling for half price. And his tagline was, amusing without being vulgar.
Now, the penny dreadful are these tabloids that existed at the time, correct?
They had these really lurid and strange stories that they told, at least for the time. They were in this milieu of superstition and kind of the sexual proclivities of the upper class and how the lower classes lived and murder and everything went into these stories that you could possibly think of.
So this would be kind of like, little boy on the street yelling out, "Read all about it. Lord Savile has been violated by a python."
Exactly. And that python might even have liked it.
Okay, so continue on.
That's exactly what they were on about. But this whole idea of being amusing but not vulgar, that's important to this story. In any case, in World War I, the Brits actually weren't all that great at propaganda. The Germans were actually quite good at it and better than they were. And so they decided they would get Lord Northcliffe to kind of do his thing. Whatever he did in the newspapers, well, maybe he can do the same thing with propaganda. And so they made him kind of the chief of foreign propaganda in 1918. He in turn then hired a Canadian by the name of Sir Campbell Stewart. He was a really interesting character and he would be worthwhile having a look at all on his own. But he was then hired to run this thing on a daily basis. So he did the real grunt work of putting together all of this propaganda. And what he did is he went out and he hired some important people. He had people like H.G. Wells working for him. So he didn't go out and just hire anyone. He got people who knew what they were doing. And again, this carries on.
And so, for those people who don't know, who haven't read H.G. Wells, of course, one of the most famous science fiction authors of the early 20th century, and he wrote, of course, the famous The Time Machine.
The Time Machine, of course, yes. He wanted people with imagination, and he really turned them loose on all of this. So now World War One ends, of course, in 1918. They'd only been running for a couple of months, and they kind of closed up shop, kind of went their merry way. Northcliffe died shortly after that, but along comes World War II. And the Brits said, oh, okay, we know what we need. We need good propaganda. We're not going to get beat by the Germans again. And so they went back to Campbell Stewart, and they now made him in charge. He had become the director of propaganda to enemy countries. That was his official title.
Enemy country. Just the enemy country.
Yes, because they weren't sure who they were fighting with, right? They didn't want to necessarily identify the Germans all on their own, because there were other countries out there as well. And so what he did is he went out and hired people like Noel Coward, who was a famous playwright. He hired all kinds of other literary people. At one point, he actually had George Orwell working for them. He was supposed to be working with the BBC, but what the BBC didn't know was that he was actually working for the political warfare executive, kind of keeping an eye on the BBC. But that's a whole other story. He also had people like Thomas Mann writing for them. So you can see that he, again, was looking for people with imagination and people who could tell a story.
Now, remind the listeners who Thomas Mann is. He's not English.
No, he's not English. He's German. He had kind of exiled himself from Germany when Hitler came to power. He'd won a Nobel Prize. He'd written some novels like The Buddenbrooks and Magic Mountain and a few other pieces that were really well known in the world. And these are things that you still study nowadays at university, and not even just specifically in a German program. This is world literature. This guy is a significant author, significant writer. And so he ended up writing some texts for the British propaganda industry. It was at this point, though, at the very beginning, where things started getting really dark. That is, this upper echelon of people started disappearing. And that's not the dark part, but it started being taken over by people who were actually working in military intelligence. We don't want to say MI6 because no one has ever really kind of confirmed any of these people. But there you had people like Robert Bruce Lockhart. And I'm not going to imagine that anybody other than me kind of knows who he is. There's probably some people in the academic world that know who Robert Bruce Lockhart is. But he had written a bestseller after the First World War about his activities in Russia / Soviet Union. He was even arrested in the Soviet Union at the time for allegedly having plotted to kill Lenin. And he was actually also found guilty of that and sentenced in absentia to death. So he never did go back to the Soviet Union because they would have had him shot if he had. There's also a persistent rumor that he was actually involved in the death of Rasputin. He was an MI6 operative, took care of passports and things like that at the British Embassy and consulate in Moscow, but he also had other interests that he pursued, shall we say. And so this guy eventually then takes over this political warfare executive. And so you can see now things are getting dark.
So this political warfare executive, what exactly was its purpose? And you refer to it in your writing and everything as the PWE, so I guess that's how it was referred to at the time, I would imagine.
What they were supposed to do was undermine German and enemy morale. They really needed to contribute to the war effort. In other words, they created an environment in which Britain could then win the war. But more importantly, as you look at the documentation, the memos that are exchanged between these people, they were supposed to win the peace for Britain as well. So always in the back of their mind was, okay, what's Europe going to look like when we win this war? They never talked about if we win this. It was always when we win this war. What is Europe going to look like, and how are they going to relate to us in Britain? And more importantly, what kinds of business interests can we protect? So this is The political warfare executive created forged stamps, for example. If you wanted to mail a letter, for example, you had to take a good look at the stamp because they created forged stamps that looked like ordinary German stamps of the period, except that if you looked at the picture of Hitler on it, there would be a skeleton showing through where, his skin would normally be. All kinds of little things like that. These were little propaganda things that they did. So you might get a letter from someone. It may have passed through the German mail system, and you would have noticed on the stamp that Hitler doesn't look particularly well.
That seems a little childish and potentially not that useful. Am I crazy?
You're not crazy. However, if you think about it, a person looking at that stamp would then immediately know that this is not the genuine article. And they would know that someone has infiltrated the German postal system, that they don't have the control of the various functions of government, as it were, that they think they do. So these were little things that just kind of undermine what was happening in Germany and Europe at the time.
This sort of reminds me of stories like Roald Dahl's The Twits. And I know he was also involved in some of this, either during the war or post-war, if I understand correctly.
I actually have seen his application to the PWE to work for them. So yeah, he did work for them. Roald Dahl was someone that worked for them. Ian Fleming, and he came up with a couple of very interesting ideas. One of them was to plant the supposed D-Day information on the body of some poor soul who had died and got dumped into the channel so that the Germans could find him and find these plans and think, aha, we know what the British are up to. And of course, these were completely fake.
How do we get from the PWE in this state to using porn to take down the Nazi regime?
What you have is essentially a bunch of British gentlemen sitting around with not much to do but great imaginations. And they hired a fellow by the name of Sefton Delmer, Dennis Sefton Delmer. He's a really, really interesting character. He was actually born in Germany. His father was a professor at the university here in Berlin. He grew up in Berlin. He was, however, a Brit. He spoke perfect German, and in fact, when he spoke with a Berlin dialect. In other words, you would not have been able to tell him apart from someone else. So these men in their tweed suits and such, smoking their cigars, decided, well, what can we do to undermine Germany? Well, one of the things we can do is we can hire this guy who seems to know the German psyche really well and have him guide us through some of the things we might be able to do. They very quickly discovered that they didn't want to know what he wanted to do. So they kind of gave him his own office. And for the most part, he was left alone to his own devices. He hired his own staff.
It sounds to me like nobody really liked this fella. I mean, you don't give someone carte blanche and just put him to the side and just walk away. What was this character like?
Was a newspaper guy. He was really quite outgoing. He was someone who was really adept at getting information out of other people. And one of the things, apparently, that he did really well is listen. He simply let people talk. So he didn't interrupt them very much. He just let them go on, and they would kind of open up to him. The interesting thing was that in the early 1930s, when they still had real elections in Germany, he was covering Hitler himself. In fact, actually did interviews with Hitler and reported them in the British press. They thought of him as one of them almost. So he has this funny sort of personality that is very likable and can be bigger than life. But on the other hand, you always, I think, seem to have this impression that there is something a little bit slimy and slippery about the man, that he used methods that weren't always what the British might say proper cricket. No, it didn't follow the rule. In reality, no, he didn't follow the rule. But then he would think to himself, now, for some reason, they don't want me to use pornography to undermine German morale and, the German system altogether. But it's okay if I point a gun at someone and shoot them. So for him, he thought he was being less immoral than someone that actually goes out and takes someone's life. I suppose he was trading off, severe psychological damage for severe political or severe physical damage. So he was someone I think that was very, very likable. But if you gave him a job, he really didn't care by which means he accomplished the task that had been set before him. Part of him being left alone was the establishment didn't really know what to do with him because he was taking their playbook and throwing it out the window. They thought that they could argue with the average German, get into a proper political argument and convince them that Germany is going the wrong direction and you really need to follow our example here in Britain because we're doing everything absolutely correctly and we're moving forward and you're moving backwards and you're a bunch of bad people and all the rest of it. He came along and said, nah, I'm going to entertain them. I'm going to have them simply listen to the subliminal messages that I'm going to send their way. I'm going to take sand and throw it into the gears of this wonderfully oiled machine and let nature take its course. And that's precisely what he did. We sometimes function on some of the more sensational things that he did. He did all kinds of radio broadcasts. He had a character that he had created called Der Chef, the chief, the boss. And he would broadcast to Germany, to a German audience. And he was this real right-wing Prussian type of character that everybody would today at least associate with, the typical German officer. If you think of that character in Indiana Jones, the guy on the Zeppelin that ends up getting tossed out the window, that's kind of the character that he was producing in terms of being the chef. Now, if you think of it at that time, this was something new. This was something different. If we think of it today, you have to put it on the same level as something like, the mockumentaries we have today, where it kind of mimics reality, but is actually fairly tightly scripted. And so that's what he was doing. He was creating this character who was saying outrageous things about people like Winston Churchill. That he was a fat Jewish, I don't want to get too nasty, but I think you kind of get the drift. Fat Jewish pervert who liked nothing better than to screw young girls, all the rest of that.
So in some ways, this is kind of like Stephen Colbert when he was doing the Colbert Report in terms of playing this character.
Yes. Now, why would he do that? Because he was convinced, and rightly convinced, that the Germans believed that no Brit would ever say such things about the prime minister. And so this broadcast had to be legit. It had to be made by someone within Germany. Now, the other thing that the average German didn't know, and there's no reason that they should have known it, is that they had a radio station they called it Aspidestra. And Aspidestra is a plant that just kind of sits in the corner. If you look it up, sometimes it maybe blooms once a year or whatever, but for the most part, it's disregarded. This was the most powerful radio station in the world. It was one that had been built in the United States. They lost their customers when the American government limited the actual power of radio stations. Like it was off the scale in terms of its strength. And so along came the Brits and said, we'll buy that. And so they did. They brought it back to the UK and they used it in a clandestine way. Now, why would they need this really, really powerful radio station? They could have used one of their regular radio stations to do this kind of work, but because it was so powerful, it gave the impression that the signal was coming from within Germany. The other thing that they had to do, and this was one of these interesting things, they would coordinate this with bombing raids on German cities. Because the Germans, of course, they also had radar. We often go on about the Brits having radars. The Germans also had radar. And they could see the bomber streams coming. They just didn't know where they were going to go. So what do? Well, you turn off all the electricity. You turn off the lights. You turn off all of the electricity, all of the radio stations, because those radio beacons can be used to triangulate and then guide you into your targets. So they got shut down. As soon as they shut down, the Brits turned Aspidestra on. In other words, there was an almost seamless blend of the German station and then on came their chef. So the Germans thought, okay, this is just a regular guy here in Germany who's taken over our local station and is broadcasting to us. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that's going on. And this man, their chef, he was vulgar. There were transcripts of some of his rants that were sent to British parliamentarians. And there were some that had even claimed that they'd rather lose the war than behave in such an outlandish way. Now, we don't know exactly what the quote was that he had read, but he was really upset about it. The British government, on the other hand, said, well, no, he can go ahead to do this work. It's fine. It's really interesting the tensions that it was also causing within the British government.
I'm very curious, Erwin. At the end of the war, or at least, in your research backwards, how believable was it for the average German? Were there records of people saying, "Oh, I listened to this and I actually believed this"?
Yes, and they actually did that during the war. They did public opinion surveys after the war, and they found that yes, they had listened to these broadcasts, and yes, they had found them to be believable. But during the war, what they did is they questioned POWs. So they sat down with POWs and they discovered that they were actually receiving the signals in Germany that they had maybe surrendered as a result of, or they had made some reference to their family having listened to it and had encouraged him to surrender. So there was that effect going on. And it wasn't so much that they caused so many surrenders that, the German army collapsed. That's not the case at all. What happened was you created friction again within the German military. Soldiers not knowing if they could trust the person next to them. That was one of the big things that they were doing. They were sowing this mistrust between people. And so, yes, they were getting what they called them comebacks. They would sometimes also hear from various cells of the French or Belgian or Dutch resistance who would say, oh, yeah, we had heard this broadcast and we had heard in the marketplace people talking about this, that, or the other thing. So they had a number of different ways of finding out what worked, what didn't work, and they adjusted their approach over time as a result of what they were hearing. Now, the interesting thing is, at the same time, the British were surveying or trying to get the comebacks, as it were, from what they called SIBs. SIBs are whispers or rumors. We call it kind of the rumor mill. They did a survey of how many Brits were listening to German radio. And they discovered that there were about as many Brits listening to German radio as there were Germans listening to British radio. And what they discovered out of that was the Brits didn't trust the BBC entirely either. They wanted to hear the other side of the story too. And so some of the Germans would say, yeah, well, we wanted to hear, we know what our people are saying. We know what Hitler and Goebbels and these guys are saying. Well, we want to hear what the Brits are saying. So they'd say, well, that's not all that serious, our interest in it, but we just want to hear what they're talking about as well. This had to do with the radio broadcasts. There were other things that were happening though too, and I should mention a place. It's called Woburn Abbey. That's where all this work took place. A place off in the country, in the British countryside. Very often we talk about, where the Enigma was decoded, where it was cracked. Well, that was actually kind of an open secret. Woburn Abbey was actually far more closed. And how did you actually get recruited into this? Sefton Delmer, when they recruited him, they actually sent a number of people out to shadow him, to follow him, because he still spoke with a slight German accent. He never had, and he hated the fact that he didn't have perfect English. He spoke with a German accent, although he was a Brit. And so they had these people following him, meeting him by chance, on the bus or at the market or whatever. And they wanted to, because they were suspicious, because of the work he had done in terms of interviewing Hitler and such, they thought maybe he was a German plant. And so they finally sat down with him and they did an interview with him. And he noted his annoyance at the amateurish way they had gone about trying to get this information, because he had identified each and every one of the people that had come to talk to him. But the way you were then introduced to the PWE, you didn't know it existed. You would one day come to your office and sit down at your office, and you would notice there was an envelope or a piece of paper. And I've seen some of these. There's a fellow by the name of Walmsley who had kind of gifted this to the Imperial War Museum, and I went and I had a look at it and took some pictures of it. But you got this letter that said, you will be joining the fight against Germany, and you will need to pack 2 days worth of clothing and take enough sandwiches along for a day. There is a car waiting for you down on the street. Go there and get into it. Do not engage the driver in conversation. That's how you were recruited. You then went down to the vehicle, you got in the vehicle, and the vehicle then drove off. It also explained to you that they were taking you to a hotel called the Sugarloaf in Dunstable, and that you were to walk into this hotel and that you were to ask for a certain Mr. Gibbs Smith. If he wasn't there, you were to wait in the pub or wherever. I've seen this hotel. It's a nondescript hotel in Dunstable. And so you sat there and you waited for someone who identified themselves as Mr. Gibbs Smith to show up to pick you up. And it instructed you again, you do not engage this gentleman in conversation. I don't even know, I'm not sure his name was Gibbs Smith. You got into the vehicle and he then drove you to Woburn Abbey. Woburn Abbey is actually quite an impressive place. When you drive up the front drive, it's just incredible. The thing is, you didn't get to drive up the front drive. You had to go around the back. You had to take the servants' entrance, as it were. And that's because they didn't want to call too much attention to what was going on there. And once you arrived there, you would then discover that you were now a member of the PWE and that they had work for you to do. And there were a number of things that they could have you do. Some of it was writing propaganda leaflets, black, gray, or white. Black was the ones where the Germans wouldn't necessarily know that this was coming from Britain. It was made to look as though it was local or from somewhere else. Gray was kind of this wishy-washy, wasn't all that sure. And white was essentially what the British Broadcasting Service did, the BBC. You knew it was coming from Britain and such. So you could write some leaflets along those lines. You could write or create radio broadcasts that were either obvious propaganda or appeared to mimic German broadcasts, like their chef. You could try to buy a German submarine. You could also run a print shop. You could load empty bombshells with leaflets. About 10% of every bomb load that went over Germany was actually leaflets. Because what you did is you dropped these bombs along with the other bombs, and it would then distribute the leaflets in amongst the rubble and make it look as though it was local and not that it had come down from above. You could create and communicate with resistance cells in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Albania, or anywhere else. You could create the false illusion that there was a resistance in Germany. You could write postcards to grieving German mothers. These are particularly nasty because they would talk about, they could monitor fairly often who had died. I mean, you listened to the radio traffic. And what they would then do is they would try to locate these people. And I've seen these addresses. And so they could write to people specifically. And what they would do is they would say things like, yeah, we know your son has died and it's really horrible. And I was in a bed next to him. And the doctors came by and decided that he was not going to be able to survive in a way that would be useful to society. So they had him put down, as it were. This is what they would put in these letters and postcards. And the way they would smuggle them in is they would send them to Sweden. From Sweden, they would take them across to Germany. They had a whole network of then putting these things into the mailboxes in Germany. They would just mail them using regular German mail. They also created pornography in the service of His Majesty.
And we come back to Mr. Delner.
Yes, he was notorious for that. He was given that name, and then he wore that as a proud badge of honor, as His Majesty's director of pornography. And one of the most interesting things that he did was, how do you get a German soldier to hang on to a piece of paper that could essentially get him shot? It was minimum 2 years in prison. And this was a piece of paper, and Passierschein. This was a document that you were supposed to show the other side when you surrendered, when you deserted your post, and you gave them this document. It entitled you to 2 packages of cigarettes, a cup of coffee, good treatment, and then being shipped off to Britain to a POW camp. This was something that could cost a soldier his life. And soldiers would want to hang on to these things, but they also didn't want to die in the process. So how do you get them to actually hang on to it? You put porn on it. On the one hand, the pornography is kind of self-explanatory. They want to keep this porn to use as they might use when they get lonely at night. There's also evidence in the comebacks that they traded with one another, the soldiers. So it wasn't always the same picture on there. There were a variety of different pictures that they had depicted on the backs of these Passierscheine, these surrender documents. And so they would hang on to it simply because it was porn. On the other hand, they would also fold them in such a way that if someone checked them, it wasn't obvious that there was this document in there, that you had the porn, and an officer might look, oh yeah, okay, typical soldier, pornography, and might not look at the other side. But if he did happen to look at the other side, the soldier could always say, "Oh, I don't know what that is. I took it for the porn." And so there is evidence that this actually did work. And he was always looking for a way, not so much for the sake of the pornography, but what can I use this, or how can I use this to camouflage what I actually want to do?
And what did he want to do?
Well, he wanted to create this distrust in amongst the soldiers on the front. And the way he did that is all the soldiers knew, because they were trading with one another, and they all had this Passierschein on the inside. And I trust this guy. Is he going to be there tomorrow for me? There's a chance that he might not be. The first chance he gets to surrender, he's going to do that, and I'm going to be left in the lurch here, and I'm going to die as a result. So that was really the point and purpose of this. It wasn't that individual surrender that he was looking for. He was looking at the greater effect within the German army of the soldiers not being able to trust one another.
There's also part of the strategy, if I'm correct in understanding, was that they also wanted to depict the leadership of the German people as being morally corrupt, that these are people that I should not want to follow. When I was growing up in the 80s, it was almost common, because I grew up in a British society mostly, that you would actually talk about the Nazis in multiple different ways. One, they committed a Holocaust. They were the wrong side in World War II. The leadership of the Nazi Party were somehow morally corrupt.
This is one of these long-term effects of this propaganda. And you still notice it here in Germany. That is, you have this tension between the Northern Germans, or the Bavarians will refer to us as Piefkes, or Prussians. Even, whether you're Prussian or not, you're all Prussian. And we will look derisively at the Bavarians in their Lederhosen and their Bierstein and think of them as being terribly undisciplined. And they will see us as being overly disciplined and far too much by the rules and, all the rest of it. And it's exactly these sorts of messages that were then also sent out to the rest of the world in terms of what the general image of the German was. However, what Delmer did is he created this image of the typical German, and then he said, what if we take that and we flip that for their leadership? We'll make them exactly the opposite. So what he was doing is he was using sex as a psychological weapon. That is, he believed that sexual jealousy, hypocrisy, and resentment were nearly universal emotion. That is, everybody felt this at some time. So he wanted to take this and, okay, how can we manipulate this? His broadcast then repeatedly alleged that the local Nazi party officials were seducing soldiers' wives. And those are the images that are then portrayed in these pamphlets. And what the chef is talking about is the Nazi leadership, seducing these poor soldiers' wives. So you're sitting there at the front getting shot at, and you're bombarded with these images, on the leaflets, but also the messages via radio that the guys back home are having a great time with your girl.
What's amazing to me is that what they were broadcasting and saying to the German people about moral corruption in terms of using sex and everything else, the truth of the true moral corruption of many of the Nazi people, let's say those in concentration camps and in death camps, was actually far, far worse and probably not believable to the average German.
That's right. There are very few examples of the British actually putting that out there. One of the really, truly frightening things is that I came across a whole set of files in which they were discussing how they can get the French, the Belgians, the Poles, and such to volunteer to work in Germany. In other words, this notion of the Germans using slave labor. Yes, that happened. I'm never going to deny that. But on the other hand, there were a bunch of people that were being encouraged to go to Germany and work in Germany, in German industry, and produce weapons for them and all the rest of it. At the same time, what the British then did is they broadcast to Germany and in leaflets as well, saying, you can't trust those foreign workers that are now coming to Germany. They would then send these same sorts of leaflets, these pamphlets and messages to the soldier at the front saying, you're having a really rough time here on the Russian front while some Frenchman is banging your girl back home. They didn't use the word bang. So there was a lot of this sort of stuff going on within the propaganda of the time. And it actually proved to be very, very effective because a lot of what you still see there in those leaflets and those broadcasts and hear in those broadcasts has kind of made its way into German society in terms of the kind of the preconceived notions that they might have about foreigners who might come to Germany. So there is this long-term effect.
This type of warfare that you have written about and studied, was it actually effective in bringing the Nazi regime to its knees at the end?
In the end, it wasn't just this, but it was also what happened after the war, because the PWE and the Psychological Warfare Division and such, they then transformed into the re-education units in the various divisions of Germany. The French, they didn't really care, but the British and the Americans did. And the Russians, to a lesser degree, didn't, as long as you were going to toe the socialist line. They often didn't care. But the Americans and the Brits did, because they then took these units and transformed them into these re-education units. In other words, they would then go through German society and make sure that the right people were in place to run the newspapers, to run the media, to run all of these sorts of things. It did continue that way. So remember what I said at the beginning about winning the peace. I would suggest that this was actually more about winning the peace than winning the war itself. Although the war itself, there are examples of German technology not functioning as it should. And what they did was they put out pamphlets that these foreign workers would get in their hands, and it would explain how they could sabotage. Now, is there a direct line where I can say, this ended the war? No. But it's an accumulation of all of these bits and pieces that's important. You still had to have the soldiers going in and actually taking possession, the dirt.
Well, okay, so that brings us to what happened afterwards. We're going to have a part 2 because there's just so much here to talk about than we could do in one go. Because obviously this didn't end when peace rang out in Europe.
That's right. And we're going to talk about its effects immediately after the war. But I think more important for us is how these techniques that I found in the British archives from the Second World War are echoed today.
Fantastic. Erwin, let's continue next week and we will wrap up this amazing story.
Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
We will continue the discussion in the next episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Please join Erwin and I as we delve into the after effects of all this propaganda, even in today's German society. As noted, there are some images provided by Erwin on my show notes at tales.dupes.ca. That's TALES.DUPS.ca. I will have more for next week's episode. Thank you to Dr. Erwin Warkentin for his time, his extensive research, and getting me all the material. If you want to reach Dr. Warkentin or me, you can send a message to contact@dups.ca. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dupes.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human imagination. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited and created by me, your host, Dileepa Vijayawardena. If you are lucky enough to have a pet, give them some treats and a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.